How do you manage asynchronous and synchronous learning? How do you take attendance when half of your students are in the classroom and half of them are online? How do you foster a community while half of your students aren't present with the other half of the students? Or how do you take hybrid learning and turn it into a more effective teaching model? Welcome back to the Teacher's Brew. Happy Wednesday. On this Wednesday, I like to look at what other people are talking about and how they're viewing education and how we can learn from them. And today, I was reading an article by John Spencer on John Spencer's website. He also has a podcast, has a great YouTube channel. He has a lot of great information. I will link that in the show notes. But John Spencer has an article that I think you need to see. Not just, I can just tell you about it. I think you actually need to see it. So I have it up here, and I'm going to be working through it just briefly to show you a few things that I think, if your school is going hybrid, you need to be aware of. Let's start with this article. And the whole purpose of the article, by the way, the framing of the article is, hey, let's think about how school is going to look from a student perspective before we get into our educational minds. And it's a good way to start. Here's his article right here. It says 5 models for making the most out of hybrid learning. Again, that is linked below so that you can easily get here. Has a nice little introduction. I'm going to skip for time and hop right into 5 ways to structure hybrid learning. Then he has kind of this little graph here. I think is fantastic. You should save that for later. It's a great way to just be aware. Even if you're only going to be doing one of these methods, it's helpful to have all of them in mind because it gives you some alternatives and depending on how things are going. And you know right now, as ever, education is necessary. Or rather, flexibility in education is absolutely necessary. So let's take a look at the first model, which is the differentiated model. The differentiated model means whether they're in person or at home, they're going to attend class synchronously. So they're all on at the same time. So if they're in person, they're with you here in physical person, of course, in physical reality. And if they're in the virtual reality and they're at home, then they're connected via some kind of video conference program. And basically the differentiated model says we're all in this together, we're all working at the same time. I'm here as a teacher managing both, but if you're at home, you're doing different things than you're doing if you're in school. That's basically what the differentiated model is. Has some great tools like a sample class lesson, as well as a project-based lesson for those of you that are into the project-based learning. Second is the multi-track model, which basically treats the 2 different groups as completely different, right? And you have kind of a plan for your in-person students and a plan for your at-home students. And then you kind of teach them separately. So I think he gives, as an example for this one, university students. Or maybe that's a different one, but it doesn't matter. The point just being that these kind of operate as 2 completely separate things, but the benefit of this, of course, would be that the effectiveness is going to be high because you're going to be thinking, what is the best possible way I can teach my at-home students? I'm giving them all of the resources I can to do that. What is the best possible way I can teach my in-person students? I'm going to give them the best possible resources for that. And so you're putting your best foot forward in both avenues differently. This is probably not going to be the one that we would call the most efficient for your life, but it might be the best for theirs. Again, some sample lessons there, which is nice, and some extra notes about project-based learning at the bottom, which is great if you do that. The split A-B model is what my school is going to be essentially doing in terms of its actual structure. Maybe not necessarily the teaching method, but the teaching method he's going to suggest fits this structure very, very well. And that's where you have A group meeting Monday, Wednesday, B group meeting Tuesday, Thursday, and then Friday for like homeroom, study hall, office hours, that kind of thing. Pretty funny when I read this, I was literally like, is he talking about our district? Because this sounds so much like our district. But the benefit of this model is essentially what you're doing is when they're in class, you're going to treat that time differently than when they're at home. So this is different than the differentiated model because for this model, it might be asynchronous when they're at home, and it might be synchronous when they're at school in person. So you're kind of going back and forth a little bit about when they're doing synchronous learning and when they're doing asynchronous learning based on what's most effective, okay? And Actually, I'll save what I'm going to say for a second because I'm going to get ahead of myself here. This one's great. It has ideas for a flipped model, for project-based model, station rotation, intervention and enrichment, seminar. Like he's got everything covered in the AB model, which is great. So I strongly recommend you come check out this resource and you read it all because it's pretty fantastic. And then the last two models are kind of different. They're based on, if I remember correctly, some students always having to be home. So it's still hybrid, but some students are always home. So if some of your students will never be in person, then this model is what that's meant for. And so the virtual accommodation model as well as the independent project model. I just want to throw out the independent project model is not a bad model for any type of version of hybrid learning. The nice thing about the independent project model is that you have students who are self-motivated to focus like Genius Hour type things where they're focused on specific things that they're really interested in, and you get that buy-in, right? The downside of the independent project model is you have to work really hard to give them the structures that they need to be successful with the independent model. That's just been my teaching experience in this particular area. It takes a lot of structure to make it successful. And if you have students that are going to always be home all the time, this one can be a challenge, but it's great because, again, you get that student buy-in. Some great videos as well goes with his stuff. And I just want to highlight this bottom section here because as I was reading this is exactly what I was thinking. There is no perfect model. So the reason I told you at the very, very top in that big yellow one I'll go to again, the reason I told you should save this document, if I were you, that's what I would do, because I'm doing that, is because some classes might operate differently than other classes, and depending on what you teach, I teach different content areas because I'm an electives teacher, and so I teach various technology and STEM classes, and some of my classes definitely going to fit that A-B model split that he outlines there, and then some of my classes are going to fit more of a differentiated type of teaching where I'm going to have all of my students with me at the same time and then give them activities that are different based on if they're in person or they're at home. So I strongly recommend you go check that out. It's an awesome resource. Now, before I go, I just want to leave you with a few more thoughts about what I've been processing about hybrid learning as I've been talking to colleagues and as I've been thinking about my different content areas and how I'm going to teach. Just a few extra thoughts. One being attendance. This is something I talked about with one of my colleagues yesterday. How do we take attendance while we have online, in-person, whatever? How are we going to do that? Is it going to be based on assignments turned in? Is it going to be based on them being in the virtual classroom with you? And my opinion is, man, set up a warm-up time that is a 5-minute section of time. You can use that based on yesterday's formative assessments, exit tickets, that sort of thing. So you're starting class and you're getting them back into the mindset and the frame of what they're learning, and have them do it at home and virtually, the same exact warm-up maybe even. And then while they're doing that, that's when you're taking roll. You can obviously take attendance when students are walking in the door, and then the students that are at home, you're going to have half of them there, so it might seem daunting. I know 30 students in a virtual classroom is a lot of attendance taking. However, I've found that taking attendance on a piece of paper and then transitioning it to a computer a few moments later at the appropriate, when students are working on something, is far more efficient for me. So I can get it done a lot quicker in that moment so that I'm able to be there with students as they need help early on in the class. But I'm thinking of having that warm-up time be the time where I'm taking attendance, getting students back in the mindset of learning and the content area that they're learning about in my classroom, but then also kind of making sure that I'm getting my online students hooked up and then getting my in-person students ready to go as well. Another thing that I've been thinking about is how to increase student achievement with the hybrid learning model. And one of my classes, for example, robotics, is very collaborative. And this pandemic is actually going to provide us with an opportunity. For the student safety, we can't have all these shared materials that they're all touching, right? So what that's going to provide is an opportunity for us to then really focus in on the engineering roles. What are the different roles involved in the design process and the build process and construction. There are lots of different roles involved in all of those different professions, from parts managers to builders to designers to documenters. There's lots of different roles involved. And so I'm seeing opportunities here with the hybrid learning model where students are in person. This would be more in the differentiated model, where students that are in person are doing more hands-on stuff, while students are at home are doing more supportive learning, right? They're doing some other different roles that are also going to benefit them. I've seen the same thing with like language arts. If you're trying to study a text and you have one student that's always talking all the time, then how can you utilize groups to have students that are at home doing some form of documentation while students in person are doing a different form of documentation? Just ideas in my mind that I'm thinking there are some ways in which hybrid learning can actually be more effective than full in-person learning, because it forces students to accept different roles that normally they are uncomfortable taking. And so it pushes them in the direction of having to do these different things. The managing of that's going to have its own challenges attached to it, of course, but I'm really optimistic about the hybrid learning model. I eventually obviously want to be full in person and go back to the way things were in some form or fashion, but while it's hybrid, I think there are some advantages that we can take advantage of and use while we're teaching. So that's what I'm learning today. I'm interested to see how this hybrid learning is going to go, and I can't wait to try it out. I will report back to you throughout the next number of weeks to show how it's progressed and what models or teaching strategies I've picked up along the way.